Thursday, November 25th, 1943. This is the menu for everybody. And it's roast turkey, giblet gravy, cranberry sauce, nut dressing.
They had quite a nice little comfortable community.
They were not tortured. They were not ill-treated. They received good medical care. And this was all part of the plan.
Potatoes, yams, peas, asparagus tips.
They played a lot of soccer. They had library books. They played in orchestras.
All of the plans are based upon the Geneva Convention.
So they may have worked their 8 hours just like we do, but then they had a lot of time that they could socialize. And
this is not a situation where you would have a prison environment where they were locked down and so forth. It was not that at all. They had a great deal of freedom. So the American soldiers were not monitoring these people constantly. It was nothing like that at all.
The Nazis controlled the camp at night.
Das Kostbarste wir sind auf dieser Welt aber, ist das eigene Volk.
The Germans were responsible for the discipline in the camp.
And they'd put them in this room, and sometimes they'd leave a rope and a chair there.
There were beatings of men who got out of line. There were a number of very, very suspicious suicides, men found hanged in the showers.
And then they'd say it'd be better if he was buried, dead by morning. And if they weren't, then they were assisted.
There were no guards in the camp at night. The prisoners were generally common soldiers, but all of the German army units had Nazi agents in them. And their purpose was to make sure that soldiers towed the line and that the Nazi idealism was a fact for them to come and understand and keep them in line, essentially.
a lot of the young men who went to war were not for the war, or particularly Hitler, but they really had no choice. And you were just afraid to voice your own opinion.
I think the difference with Kuntz was that he wasn't afraid to speak up, and that's what probably got him into trouble. You have to understand that the way the camps operated is that they were run by the non-commissioned officers of the German army.
You're now not my equal, you're still my subordinate. It doesn't matter that we're prisoners, it doesn't matter that we're not in Germany anymore, it doesn't matter that we're in the middle of Oklahoma. The hierarchy still prevails.
Piling into trucks for camps behind the lines, glad that as far as they're concerned, the war is over.
Those who you want to define as fanatical ideologues, they would want to continue the fight even in prison.
The U.S. Army controlled the camps during the day. The Nazis controlled the camp at night. You could not go in the camp at night, it wasn't safe.
After sunrise, the prisoners were often safer outside of the camp, working with Americans.
I was 9 years old, and it was very difficult for my dad to get help on the farm because all of the people that were usually good workers on the farm were serving overseas in the armed forces. So the government developed a program where farmers could use prisoners of war as workers on the farm. My dad had 5 work for him. They would ride in his pickup in the back, and a guard rode in front with my dad. But the 5 that were out on our farm, they always seemed to get along well. They worked well together. But who knows what happened once they got off the pickup.
Johann was an older man. He wasn't one of the kids.
He was 40 years old, so he had lived in Germany before Hitler had come to power. People in their late teens, early 20s had been through the Hitler Youth. They had been much more thoroughly indoctrinated than he. Kuntz apparently spoke up, told some of his comrades that he didn't want to go back to Germany after the war, that Hitler had been bad for Germany, and so he put himself in a very precarious situation.
The leadership met in the chow hall that night after dark.
A secret night assembly in the dining room of the camp.
It was very cold, windy. It hadn't snowed yet in that part of Oklahoma.
The speaker of the camp had gathered the people together to expose a traitor among them, and he has that in capital letters.
He wrote a letter telling about how the Germans were camouflaging the buildings.
They accused him of giving away information to the U.S. about camouflaging of the main train station in Hamburg.
He had already written it out, had put it on paper in an envelope for the lieutenant. His clerk went into his office and found it. He was a Nazi.
This information was used to convince others that Kunz was a traitor.
By vote, he was found guilty and beaten to death.
And these people picked up the old glass milk bottles, and that's what they beat him to death with. And
the situation just completely got out of control, and Kunz unfortunately was killed. The semi-nude body was covered with blood. The man's trousers were twisted around his feet and ankles. He wore no shoes. His arms were twisted under the body, his face pressed against the ground.
5 people were seized, including the camp speaker.
They were the 5 who appeared to have more blood on their shirts and uniforms than did other prisoners.
A U.S. military court at Camp Gruber found them guilty, and the 5 Germans became the first prisoners of war in the history of the USA to be sentenced to death.
They were the ones who would be prosecuted, successfully prosecuted, and subsequently executed for Kunz's death.
Kunz's death and the resulting executions stemmed from a clash of conflicting German mindsets. However, the American administration of the camps remained single-minded in its mission.
In terms of holding and keeping prisoners of war, you want to treat them properly so that Americans who are captured in German camps will be treated well as also.
We've had probably around 20 or more German prisoners of war come back to Tonkawa in the 1980s, mostly 70s and 80s, and they uniformly described their experience here as being good.
The prisoner of war camp worked in creating friends, making allies of our enemies.